Hello, everyone. This is Independent Conservative. Thank you all for joining me once again. So, I want to talk about a subject that is very controversial, but is it's very not only is it controversial, but it's very complicated because there's a lot of elements here that needs to be talked about and needs to be addressed, and it's not as cut and dry as so many of us as Americans think it is. And that is there's a bill, issue with a bill here in Ohio that would allow, in the state of Ohio, that would allow 17-year-old teenagers to get married. Now, some of you may be like, "Oh my God, that's just insane." Is it really? To some people, they don't think it is, and to some people, they do think it's insane. That's bordering on you know what. Okay, but let's get into this. I'm going to read you a portion of this article, and then I'm going to give you my spin on this because I think that there are other elements here that the article does not mention, and rightly so. It's an article, okay? And the article is entitled, "Ohio Allows Child Marriage. Some Lawmakers Are Okay with That." And it says, some Republican state senators blocked a bill that would have closed a loophole that allows teens to marry at age 17, which means Ohio might remain among states that permit child marriage. All I know is some people in the Republican caucus thinks it's okay to have child marriage, says State Senator Bill DeMauro of Columbus, who is co-sponsoring the bill with Senator Bill Blessing of Colorado. The bill calls for raising the marriage age to 18 and older for all parties. Last week, the State Judiciary Committee planned to vote on Senate Bill 341, but senators pulled it off the agenda along with other pending bills. This week's SB 341 isn't on the committee agenda. Blessing declines that name Blessing. Blessing declined to comment, but the bill came off the committee voting agenda after Republican senators held a private caucus meeting. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Nathan Manning of North Ridgeville said advocates will meet with senators to explain why changing the law is needed. Let me see some. Friday Reese, founder of Unchained at Last, a national organization seeking to end forced and child marriage. I didn't know there was forced and child marriage. Since when? Where is this at? Where people are. Let me read this again. Freddie Reese, founder of Unchained at Last, a national organization seeking to end forced and child marriage. Hey, I mean, evidently this is happening. If this is happening in America, I don't know of any state or city that's forcing. I don't know. You guys know, let me know. But anyway, said she doesn't know who in the Senate is holding up a bill that had no opposition and would end an abusive practice that harms children. It is shameful. It is a slap in the face to girls in Ohio, she said. Always to girls, right? It's always to the females, right? In 2019, following an investigation by the Dayton Daily News, Ohio changed its marriage laws to block young teens who are often pregnant from getting married. And then it goes on talking about the newspaper found 4,443 girls aged 17 or younger were married in Ohio between 2000 and 2015, including 59 who were 15 and younger. Wow. State records show 3 girls aged 14 were married, including one pregnant bride who married a 48-year-old man, according to the report. In the 2019 revision, lawmakers included a provision for 17-year-old boys to marry if they convinced a judge that they had received satisfactory marriage counseling. They waited 14 days, and their age differential wasn't more than 4 years. And that's all I'm going to read right there. You get the gist of that article. You can look that article up in Newsbreak. Okay, but that is a controversial subject, and rightly so. And part of the reason that I believe that it's such a controversial subject, particularly here in Ohio and in the country as a whole, in America as a whole, is because many Americans still hold on to the puritanical Judeo-Christian principles of marriage, I guess. You know, well, I wouldn't say I guess, but I think that that's essentially what they're holding on to, which is interesting because in the Old Testament, in particular, young girl, if I want to understand, in ancient Jewish society, I don't know if the Jews do this now, but in the ancient Jewish society, they raised the young boys to be men at a very young age. They raised them to be husbands, they raised them to be fathers, they raised them to be great providers, and by the age of 13, they were considered men. And I think it's like at the age of 12 or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. For young women, young girls. They were considered young women at that age. But here's what was important about this back in those days. The young girls were raised at a very early age to be wives, to be keepers of the home, to submit to their husbands, to see their husbands as leaders. They were raised at a very early age. Now, you can argue, well, that's mind control, that's brainwashing. Well, we're going to get into that. Brainwashing in what way? That's my view of it. Brainwashing in what way? You could argue that it's brainwashing, but I would argue that it's brainwashing on a positive side. It's good brainwashing. If you want to argue it's brainwashing, because I'd rather for them to be brainwashed to be good wives and keep it at home and learning how to cook and all this. And I know some people think I'm being sexist, but whatever, man, whatever. And learn how to cook and whatever, and learn how to keep the house and clean and so forth, rather than what I'm seeing now with a lot of these young teenage girls and a lot of these young teenage boys. I'm trying not to jump too far ahead, because what I see now as compared to what it used to be, okay, it's horrible. These young girls are walking around in pajamas and house shoes. Their hair, they got bonnets on their hair. They stink. I'm just telling you like it is. They stink. They don't keep themselves clean. And you know what I'm talking about. In between there, you can smell it. It stinks. I have to turn my head when they get on the bus, and the young men, young boys. I have to turn my head away because of when they get on the bus to cross in the aisle, because they smell so bad. Now, where's they coming from? Okay. Somebody ain't teaching these young girls. Somebody ain't teaching these young boys. But back in those days, decades and decades ago, this was part of the culture, particularly in with ancient Jews. Like I said, I don't know if they're doing that now, but this is how they did it back in those days. In some societies today, they raise young girls to be wives, keepers of the home, know how to bear children and take care of children. They raise the young boys how to be husbands, how to be leaders, how to be providers, how to take care of the home and their wives and kids. That's what they're raised to be at a very early age, so that by the time they reach the age of maturity, or what we in America would consider to be mature, they're set. You probably are not going to have many issues with those kind of young people, because of the fact that they were raised to be husbands and wives. They were raised to be men and women. Today, it's the opposite. And I know people know I'm telling the truth. It's the opposite. You may have some exceptions with some, but for the most part, it's the opposite. Young girls today are not raised to be women. They're not raised to be. When I say they're not raised to be women, I'm not talking about this junk. I'm not talking about feminism. That's not womanhood. That's nonsense. The purpose of feminism is to destroy manhood, to destroy the patriarch, and replace it with a woman. That's the purpose of feminism. So we're not going to even go there. When I'm talking about being raised as a woman, I'm talking about from a biblical perspective, and that's not taking anything from the woman. It's actually empowering her, because when a woman knows who she is as a woman, based on what God says she is, she don't have to try to be like a man or try to compete with him, because she's secure in her womanhood, because it's based on what God says about her, not what some feminist nutbag says about her, not what society says about her. Same situation with young men. When young men have an understanding of what it means to be to be a man, to be a husband, to be a provider based on a biblical centric perspective, then they don't have to compete with other guys or compete with this person or compete with that person. They understand what it means to be a man. But we don't have that in our society today, because these young people are not being taught this. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with the marriage situation? I think people should. I'm pretty sure that some of you are able to connect the dots of what I'm leading to here. a lot of this fear that people have in America of young girls and young boys getting married at early ages is based in part on the fact that many of these young people today are brain dead. They are not being raised to be strong men, strong women. They're not being raised to be husbands and wives. They're not being raised to be keepers of the home and the husbands to be workers, to get out there and hold a job. Unfortunately, a lot of our young boys who are merged into manhood, if you want to call it manhood on their part, in terms of them being in their late teens and early 20s, can't hold a job or refuse to hold a job. It's always some excuse against the boss. They picking on me. They don't like me. When we find out that the reason why the boss is picking on them is because they're not coming to work. They're not doing their job. That's the reason why. You're not doing your job, knucklehead. And vice versa with the young lady. So I mentioned that earlier. I think a lot of this has to do with the lack of training and the lack of teaching for our young girls and young boys at an early age. And so I believe, in my opinion, that's where a lot of that apprehension comes from. And that's what that article, to me, seems to be suggesting, at least in part. Now, the other side of that is this. There's another darker side to this that I want to mention. And that is, if, say, for instance, there's some law that's passed here in the state of Ohio that would allow teenagers to get married, because the article mentions that one particular teenager was married, she's like 17, married to some 49-year-old. What that could lead to is other states, especially very liberal states, because the state of Ohio is a red state, but it would, in my opinion, open the door for a lot of these blue states, these far leftist blue states, to say, oh, okay, well, we can push the child you-know-what thing and make it legal. Why do I say that? Because there's certain things I can't mention here on this video. This video will be taken down. But it has to do with children. And it has to do with a particular nonprofit, I think it's nonprofit movement that I will not mention here, that has to do with young boys and adult men. Just put it to you like that. Now, you put two and two together. And for decades, this group of men who are in control of this organization have been trying to, for decades, to legalize young boys marrying older men. They've been trying to legalize it. So you get what I'm trying to say. There is that. There is that element. And there is that element because America stinks. It stank like a booty hole. Morally, we stink because we told God, get the heck out my face. Morally, we stink because we told morals and values to get the heck out of our schools. Morally, we stink because we told morals and values to get out of our songs, to get out of our movies. We make fun of God. We make fun of the word of God. We make fun of Jesus. They mock Jesus, upside down crosses, blasphemous words, and Christians that sit by and don't say anything about it. Anyone else, Muslims and Hindus and all the others, can come here. You won't see them mocking their religion. But oh boy, they will mock the religion of Christianity, which is interesting because from birth of this country in part was founded in part on biblical Christian principles. And these nasty people don't want that worldview. That's why they hate on Christians. But it's cool, and I digress. It's all good. Judgment Day is coming, boo-boo. But anyway, you got those two elements working. Okay? So you have the cultural element of our young boys and young girls not being raised to be young ladies, wives, keepers of the home, bearers of children the right way. Boys being raised to be men, leaders, providers for their wives and children. They're not raised that way. Let me mention something that connects to that reality. I'm pretty sure most of you guys remember the classic movie that came out in 1983, The Color Purple. Now, I don't believe The Color Purple wasn't necessarily based on a true story. It was a fictionalized account. However, the concepts of what was going on, a lot of the stuff that was happening that was portrayed in the movie, even though the movie was fiction, was true. That was true. You know, remember Celie, she got married at what, age 12, 13? The guy comes up to her, Mr. comes up to the father of Celie, and he introduces Celie to the father and says, because he didn't want her, he didn't want the, you know the story, he didn't want the Mr. to marry his other daughter, the pretty one, or the one he considered to be pretty. So he gave Mr. Celie. And Celie was young, 12, 13 years old. Now, whether or not that was legal or not, I don't know. I don't know if it was legal. But I will say this, that it was made easier to give this 12 or 13-year-old girl over to a man that clearly was in his 30s or 40s at the very latest, okay? It was made easier. Why? Because the young girls were, and during those times in the rural South, were raised to be wives and keepers of the home. So even though Celie was young, remember what her father said. He said, well, she ain't cute, but and I'm paraphrasing, she ain't cute, but she works hard. She's a hard worker. And when they showed her scrubbing and cleaning and all the rest, you knew she was a hard worker, and she could cook, even though Mr. would put her down all the time that she couldn't cook. The woman could cook. The girl could cook. Okay, and then of course he became a woman, but you get the point. She knew how to work. Her father said that she was raised to be a worker. She was raised to keep the home clean and take care of the children. And remember what Mr. said, I'm out in the field, working in the field. I be needing my children to be fed and clean. And they're running all over the place and they're throwing up all over the place. Because he understood at that time, that type of responsibility was the role of the wife. Well, the young girls at that time were raised to be wives at a very early age. Get the principle. So, once again, a lot of this apprehension comes from a lack of training our children here in America to be husbands and wives, men and women. On the flip side of it, if something like this does pass and becomes more on a bigger national level, it could become negative. Because it could open the door for many of these far left, loony states, blue states, to start pushing for legislation that would open the door for organizations like I just mentioned, although I didn't mention it, to be free to push for legislation for young boys to marry old men. In other words, justifying the PED, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? All right? Yeah, it's a complicated issue on both sides, but I wanted to speak on it because I think that those complicated issues can be addressed on both sides. Now, whether or not this should happen or not, that's a complicated issue because you have a lot of young people, like I mentioned, the article mentions young people getting married at an early age, and so 17 years old, 18 years old. If I myself had an 18-year-old daughter or an 18-year-old son and they wanted to get married, in my opinion, even if I raised them to be strong men, raised my son to be a strong man and a provider for his wife and a strong leader and provide for his wife and his family and vice versa, my wife or whatever raised, or we both raised the daughter to be a good wife and a provider of the home, a keeper of the home, and learn how to cook and all these type of things, I would still be hesitant for them to go out and get married. But the reasoning for that is because of their lack of maturity. Part of it will be the lack of their maturity, even though they would have been matured much better because I would have raised them to be, and my wife would have raised them to be. But the current economic plight that we're in and the world that we're in, I would prefer for them to wait a little while until they build their finances up, get a career or something, particularly the husband. I really want the young man to do that. Not that I'm saying I'm against the woman doing it. That's another video in and of itself, but I have a different view on that. I believe the man is the leader. He's supposed to be the number one provider, but because of the economic situations that we're living in our country in this current time, that's extremely difficult. But I believe that I would tell them, you know what, just slow down a little bit. Save up some money, make sure you have stuff in order, and then you do. So I would say, wait till you're about 20, 21, 22, maybe 25 at the very latest to get married. Okay, that way you've built up. If you went to college and got a career, got a degree, you got a degree or whatever, or you found a good job and you built seniority on that job, you putting money aside in your savings, you have an emergency account, you have a nice apartment or even saving up for a home, stuff like that. You prepare. I would tell them to prepare more for the future rather than just jump into a marriage because you think you love this girl and you think you love this boy. Okay, but it wouldn't be because of this petty stuff, if you know what I'm talking about. I'm shortening my strokes here. Okay, because they would be saved from that because I ain't gonna raise them with that nonsense. But I hope you get my point. I would be hesitant, so I can understand the hesitation with many older people today based on that. But as I said before, I believe a lot of the hesitation comes from the environment that we live, the lack of training. These young kids, they're not mature, so they're not ready for marriage because they haven't been developed at a young age to be ready for marriage for the most part. And we live in a nasty, messed up society. If my daughter, and I'm gonna sum this up, if I had a daughter and she's 17 and she comes to me and she says, "Dad, I want to get married," I'm gonna be weary of it, of course, right up front. I love this man, woo, 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 woo. And then I meet the man and he's in his 40s. I'm gonna be like, no, 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 to the no. I'm gonna say that. And I don't need to go into the details of why I would say that. But I would say, no, boo-boo. No, he's way too old for that. Remember that episode in Good Times? When, what's her name, wanted to marry that 40-year-old Louis Gossett Jr. He was the guy that she met. And she wanted to marry the guy and the man. She was like 17 and he was like in his 40s. But he said he loved her and he probably did. But she didn't really love him because, she was young. She really didn't know. You get the point. He was way too old. By the time come on, man. By the time he's 60, by the time she's, I don't know, 30, how old will he be? You know what I'm saying? The man would be falling apart unless he was exercising every day. But you get my point. It would be the same thing here if I had a daughter and she was 17 and she wanted to marry some guy that's 40-something years old. I would be hesitant and would say no based on, for the most part, the reasons I just mentioned. Okay? Even though she would have been raised to be a good wife and a good provider of the home and so forth, a keeper of the home and a mother and all that. So yeah, I would be hesitant. And you could argue that's because of the zeitgeist or the spirit of our society. You could argue that, and I would never completely reject that worldview or that zeitgeist or that spirit, because at the end of the day, it does have some influence on me. I would be hesitant. I don't live in some of these other countries, and where they train the young girls to be that way and the young boys to be that way at an early age. I don't live in those countries, so I'm not going to even try to adopt that. I just mention them because that's part of what they do, and so the transition is not as difficult for them. The transition for us is ultra difficult because of those missed elements, okay, among other things. But yeah, I could go on with this, but you get the point. It is various elements that need to be mentioned and need to be talked about, and let's just see what happens. Let's just see what happens. But that's my thought on that. What do you guys think? Leave your comments in the comment section. Like, share, and subscribe to my channel. God bless you all, and see you again.